In the story of the English monarchy, few figures attract as much fascination, gossip, and historical myth as King Charles II. When Charles II wore the crown, from his restoration in 1660 until his death in 1685, he was not just a monarch but the very image of Restoration England. Exuberant, indulgent, culturally vibrant, and politically unstable. Yet, among the many elements that make his reign unforgettable, perhaps the most famous and most talked about were his relationships with women outside of marriage. Charles had dozens of mistresses. Some were legendary beauties whose names echo through history. Others lived in quiet obscurity, and still others became powerful forces at court. But behind the rumors and tantalizing tales lies a story that reveals much about 17th century English society, politics, and the man himself. Charles II was born on May 29, 1630, at St. James's Palace in London, the eldest surviving son of King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria. His early life was shaped by turbulence, civil war, regicide, and exile. After his father's execution in 1649, Charles spent years wandering through Europe, living in Dutch houses and French courts, dependent on the hospitality of sympathetic monarchs. This period of instability left its mark on him. By the time he was restored to the throne in 1660, Charles was a man in his early 30s, worldly, socially adept, and fully aware of the political need to charm, flatter, and enjoy life. He returned to London amid enormous popular enthusiasm. Parliament and the people wanted entertainment after years of Puritan austerity. The Restoration ushered in a new age of theater, music, lavish feasts, and, perhaps inevitably, a more relaxed approach to sexual morality at court. From almost the moment he reclaimed the throne, Charles's relationships with women became the stuff of public commentary. Contemporary diaries, newspapers, known as pamphlets, and foreign ambassadors' letters all recorded his affairs with a mix of amusement and moral outrage. Unlike his father, Charles did not insist on strict marital fidelity or condemn sexual freedom, at least for himself. He married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, in May 1662, in a diplomatic union meant to secure an alliance with Portugal and provide England with a Catholic aligned port in Goa and a naval base in Tangier. The marriage was not a happy one. Catherine was pious, reserved, and unlike the exuberant English court by temperament and background. Charles, by contrast, was energetic, social, and unrestrained in his affections. Despite the royal wedding, Charles did not hide his extramarital relationships. In fact, he almost seemed to celebrate them. It is difficult to determine exactly how many mistresses he had. Contemporary reports suggest well over 24 serious relationships at various times, and many more brief liaisons. Some were long-term companions, others brief affairs. A few were foreign noblewomen who passed through England, and a few were courtiers who caught Charles's eye. Most firmly established mistresses were young, attractive, well-educated, and from families that could both offer and benefit from royal favor. In an era when marriage was often transactional, a king's attention could elevate a family's standing, secure political favors, or bring wealth. One of the earliest and most famous of Charles's mistresses was Barbara Villiers, later Duchess of Cleveland. Barbara was a charismatic beauty with charisma as wide as the Thames, and she captivated Charles in the early 1660s. Accounts from the period describe her as tall, elegant, and daring-spoken, qualities that set her apart from many of the more demure ladies of court. Barbara's influence extended beyond the bedroom. She was known to have sold offices, distributed favors, and wielded power in royal decisions. Her status was so acknowledged that Charles created her the Duchess of Cleveland in 1670. With Charles, Barbara bore at least 5 of his acknowledged illegitimate children: Charles Fitzcharles, Charlotte Fitzroy, Sir Henry Fitzroy, George Fitzroy, and Lady Barbara Fitzroy. These children, despite their illegitimacy, were provided for generously. Titles, land, and positions in court later ensured their place in English aristocracy. While Barbara Villiers was perhaps the most dominant mistress of his early reign, she was not the only one to hold significant sway. Another important figure was Nell Gwynn, whose life reads like a novel. Nell was the daughter of a poor cloth worker and raised in humble circumstances. She began her career as an orange seller in theaters, a common trade where young women sold fruit and sweets to playgoers. But Nell had a vivacity and wit that caught the attention of theater audiences and, eventually, the king. Unlike the aristocratic mistresses, Nell's appeal was not simply beauty or breeding. It was her charm, humor, and unfettered personality. She became Charles's mistress around 1668 and remained one of his most enduring companions. Nell Gwyn's position was remarkable not only for her rags to royalty rise, but for how she was received by the public, and even by Charles's queen. Catherine of Braganza, though deeply religious and often sidelined at court, reportedly treated Nell with surprising restraint. Some sources suggest that Catherine recognized that challenging the king's affections publicly would only diminish her own standing. Meanwhile, the London public adored Nell. Pamphlets, songs, and stage references portrayed her as spirited and witty, often lampooning the court but celebrating her down-to-earth presence. Nell bore Charles 2 sons, Charles Beauclerc, later the Duke of St. Albans, and James Beauclerc. These children, like Barbara's, entered the English nobility with royal favor and titles. Another notable mistress was Lucy Walter, whom Charles met during his exile in the 1640s. Lucy was Welsh, beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious. She bore Charles's eldest surviving illegitimate son, James Scott, who would become the Duke of Monmouth. Monmouth's existence later had huge political ramifications. In 1685, after Charles's death, Monmouth led a rebellion against James II, Charles's brother, claiming the throne. That uprising, the Monmouth Rebellion, ended in defeat at the Battle of Sedgemoor and Monmouth's execution. Yet before all that, Lucy's relationship with Charles was serious. Some supporters even claimed Charles had secretly married her, a claim he denied, hoping to legitimize Monmouth's claim to the throne. Charles's relationships were not limited to English women. He also had continental mistresses who reflected international alliances and fashions. For example, Henrietta Maria of France, no relation to Charles's mother of the same name, flirted with the king's affections and stood for a time as a confidant. Her presence at court illustrated how easy it was for foreign nobles to intertwine with the English king's personal life, carrying news, influence, and diplomatic significance. What all these relationships show is that Charles II's mistresses were not merely anonymous lovers. They were woven into the texture of statecraft, culture, religion, and succession. They bore his children, influenced marriages, and sometimes even shaped political decisions. In a court where gold cups, favors, and offices were routinely traded, the king's affection was among the most valuable currencies available. Context is essential here. The 17th century was a period when kings were expected to father illegitimate children. They were symbols of virility and divine favor. European monarchies often legitimized these children, arranged advantageous marriages for them, and integrated them into nobility. In France, Louis XIV maintained multiple mistresses whose children took important positions. In England, Charles's mistresses operated similarly. Some deliberately sought influence, others cherished companionship or the security that came with bearing the king's child. The king's lifestyle also reflected the cultural shift of the Restoration. After years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell, when theater was banned and moral codes were strictly enforced, the public yearned for vibrancy and indulgence. This cultural hunger aligned perfectly with Charles's persona. He patronized the arts, reopened theaters, delighted in music and performance, and welcomed revelry. His mistresses became part of this cultural flowering. They attended banquets, wore the latest fashions from Paris, and appeared in artistic depictions that celebrated beauty and charm. Yet not all relationships were so glamorous. Some mistresses suffered when the king's attention shifted, left powerless or impoverished when a new favorite emerged. Court politics were brutal, and jealousy was common. Rumors of poisoning, intrigue, and rivalry abounded in pamphlets and letters. One contemporary described the court as a lattice of snake-like alliances, where a mistress's rise could mean another's downfall. That said, Charles was not known for cruelty toward former lovers. He typically ensured they were provided for, even if he no longer favored them. Historians calculate that Charles fathered at least 14 acknowledged illegitimate children, though the true number may have been higher. Among his sons and daughters, several received ducal titles, lands, and seats of influence. For example, Charles Beauclerc became the Duke of St. Albans, Henry Fitzroy became the Duke of Grafton, and George Fitzroy became the Duke of Northumberland. These children often served in the military, held court offices, and married into powerful families. Their presence in aristocracy shaped English politics long after Charles's death. It's worth noting that Charles and Queen Catherine had no surviving legitimate children. Infant mortality was tragically high in the 17th century, even among royals, and the throne succession became a matter of anxiety and political maneuvering. Catherine had several pregnancies, but none of her children survived to adulthood. This inability to produce an heir contributed to later political turmoil. When Charles died in 1685, his brother James succeeded him, a transition that sparked conflict because James was openly Catholic in a largely Protestant nation, and because Charles's illegitimate sons, especially Monmouth, had supporters who tried to claim the throne. The public's fascination with Charles's mistresses has endured because these women were not just footnotes in history. They were in many cases powerful, visible figures. Portraits by leading artists of the day, such as Sir Peter Lely and Godfrey Kneller, immortalized their beauty. Pamphlets and satirical prints distributed news and rumor alike, making mistresses subjects of both admiration and moral criticism. Satirists of the Restoration period often seized on the king's love life as a way of mocking court excesses. Sermons in churches condemned the lechery of the court, even as the public devoured stories of gowns, jewels, and scandal. Interestingly, despite the sexual openness of Charles's reign, at least for the king himself, there was political backlash. The exclusion crisis of 1679 to 1681, which sought to bar James from succession, partly revolved around anxieties about royal morality and Protestant identity. Opponents of James argued that the royal family's loose morals reflected a broader threat to England's social order. Charles, mindful of politics, sometimes tried to temper public perception, hosting more conservative court events or attending Protestant services to reinforce his public persona. Yet his personal choices continued to draw scrutiny. Behind all the glamour and controversy, some of Charles's relationships were rooted in genuine affection and companionship. Letters survive where the king pours genuine emotion onto the page, expressing worry, longing, or generosity towards certain women. The degree of sincerity varied with each relationship, of course. Royal court life was always a mixture of performance and reality, but it is simplistic to dismiss all mistresses as opportunists or charm courtiers. For many women, the relationship with Charles brought security, influence, and status not attainable otherwise, but it also exposed them to public judgment, scandal, and political danger. In analyzing Charles's love life, scholars note that it reflected broader social dynamics of Restoration England. Patriarchy, class hierarchy, and the interplay of power were all in force. Women who became mistresses exercised a type of soft power unavailable in formal political structures. They could advocate for clients, advance petitions, and influence court appointments. Some used their proximity to the king to establish charitable works or patronage of the arts. In these cases, the traditional narrative of mistresses as mere sexual companions falls short of the full picture. They were players in a complex social ecosystem where entertainment, politics, and personal relationships overlapped. From a modern perspective, the idea of a king having mistresses might seem salacious or scandalous, but in the context of 17th century Europe, it was neither unusual nor universally condemned. Monarchs across the continent maintained unofficial relationships. What set Charles II apart was his openness and the sheer number of acknowledged offspring. The English court, emerging from Puritan austerity, embraced a certain theatricality and theatrical license. Playhouses reopened, music prospered, poetry celebrated beauty and desire. In London, the population grew rapidly in the 1660s and 1670s, and with it came a proliferation of printed literature, including pamphlets that chronicled the court's goings-on with serious journalism and raucous rumor mixed together. By the time Charles died on February 6, 1685, from what most likely was a stroke complicated by kidney and heart disease, he had lived a life larger than many of his contemporaries. His reign saw the Great Plague of 1665, the Great Fire of London in 1666, wars with the Dutch, and political strife that foreshadowed the later Glorious Revolution. Yet alongside these seismic social and political events, the personal life of the king, his relationships, his children, his mistresses, remained at the forefront of public interest. Long after his death, Charles's mistresses continued to shape literature, history, and popular imagination. Nell Gwyn became a stock character in plays and novels, celebrated as the quintessential witty, charming commoner who captivated a king. Barbara Villiers's political ambitions and brazen personality made her a model for later portrayals of court power brokers. Their children carried forward lines of aristocracy that still appear in British pedigrees today. What can we learn from this extraordinary chapter of English history? For one, the story of Charles II and his dozens of mistresses shows how personal relationships can intersect with political power. In a period when communication was slower, literacy was rising, and political factions were jockeying for influence, personal intimacy was a form of political leverage. For another, the king's love life illuminates how Restoration England redefined cultural norms after years of strict Puritan governance. The return of monarchy brought back the arts, pleasure, and public spectacle, and with them came a renewed, if controversial, embrace of public fascination with sex, power, and personality. Yet perhaps most intriguingly, Charles's relationships remind us that history is populated not only by events and dates, but by human lives, messy, emotional, contradictory, and vivid. The mistresses of Charles II were not simply accessories to a king's pleasures. They were agents in their own right, navigating a world of privilege and peril, shaping history in ways both obvious and subtle. The legacy of Charles II is thus inseparable from the legacy of those who shared his bed, bore his children, advised him, challenged him, and for a time, helped create the world around him. Their stories, sometimes lost, sometimes exaggerated, reveal the rhythms of power, desire, and human complexity that define royal life. In understanding them, we understand not just a king, but an era, an age of rebirth, contradiction, and transformation in which the personal was always political, and the political was always personal.